shall begin. Is it okay for you, dear partners and friends? Hold me close to the mouth. Closer, you mean? Okay. Oh, good. Thank you. So, this web conference has two titles in French. Enrichir la compréhension des territoires urbains par la confrontation des langues. In English, multilingual approaches as a means of enhancing the understanding of urban territory. We have a few people here in Paris, mainly from ENSAPM and from CIEP, two French partners of the RT21 project. We have our dear partners online. We hope it will be an interesting event. I will introduce a bit later the participants in the conference. First, I would like to say very, very shortly a few words, make a kind of short reminder of the initial statements and the goals of the RT21 project, because this peculiar lexicon or glossary project was born in this framework. And then I would like to explain a few characteristics of this lexicon or glossary project. So the initial departure point was a kind of acknowledgement of the unsatisfactory situation of the teaching of second language in architecture higher education. Inside the cohort, the situation were different, still all agreed with this idea of the situation not being satisfactory. If we take the example of France, the teaching of at least one second language is compulsory in the architecture curriculum. Yet there is a separation or even a marginality of this teaching in relation to content courses with all the effects you can guess, such as irrelevancy of content, teacher status, and so on. The goal of the RT21 project was to promote an approach not much used in higher education, which can be summed up as integration. Its name in English is Clear Content and Language Integrated Learning. In French, it is Enseignement d'une matière par l'intermédiaire d'une langue étrangère. I found out with a lot of pleasure, really, that Google Translation translated automatically Clear into Yemeni. In the project, there was a special focus on 3D technologies and environments, amongst which virtual worlds. The project took a strong position on the reasons to learn foreign language in architectural education. In opposition with the very, very common ideas of language as a technical tool, it insists on its very specific relevance in architectural education. Some activities and deliverables produced through the project about CLIL and technologies, experimentations, leading to case studies. There was an architectural production through Second Life and Second Language with two architecture teachers and a linguistic scaffolding. There was an architectural review with a distant American architect through Second Life. An induction course was produced, a matrix of affordances of the different technologies and softwares. About CLIL and architecture, two reference frameworks of skills for CLIL teachers, both in content and language. Guidelines for setting up a CLIL language course adapted to the need of students in higher school of architecture. Now, how and why was the seed of the territory glossary sowed in the RT21 project? A European project is a concentrate of multilingual and multicultural experience, where one discovers that as partner, the important is not that we do not say the same thing in different languages, but that we say, what we say is different. It has very important consequences for European projects in general. All opportunities to clarify differences of meaning or shades must be taken. It will never be a loss of time in the management of the European project. For RT21, promoting an educational lingua franca might be a temptation, but it leads to failure because it does not allow the intellectual exchanges that might arise from differences and induced downgrading of the lingua franca itself. Improving language skills implies glossary or lexicon entries based on intercultural competence, using conceptual definitions and sensibility, are complex tasks. They require a high degree of collaboration between content and language teachers in a CLIL approach. But being on new grounds, this collaboration can be very rich and innovative. Another important point in this action and in this philosophy is that it gives a chance to the Erasmus mobility program to produce richer effects by taking into account the competence of students. Let them be our students in other countries or the students we receive in our higher education institutions. I would like now to introduce the speakers in the conference. First, two teachers from ENSAPM, Jean Attali, who will speak in English and present the Master's Research Seminar as a micropolitical and potentially multilingual environment. Then Stephen Melamis, who will present the glossary itself, Territories, an image and word glossary, a self-critical approach to the objectives and method of a teaching experiment. Then we will have a discussion time. Then we will have two presentations in French from CIEP. We usually call them CIEP in our project, but the French acronym is CIEP. So the first one will be Case Studies, Limits of the Vocabulary-Oriented Approach in the CLIL Context by and not Manuela Ferreira Pinto, as was announced. And the second one will be by Annick Bonnet, The Impact of Erasmus Mobility on Personal Identity Building and Linguistic and Intercultural Competence. Both presentations will be in French and will be simultaneously translated by Anna Maria Roffi. Thank you. And then we will have a second time for discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, dear partners and colleagues. I would like to witness a teaching experience I have currently with 6 of my colleagues. It's not a multilingual experience, but potentially we have an opportunity to develop such an experience, and I would like to explore the ways it would be possible to do that. This experience is the master seminar within which students are supposed to prepare a dissertation. And the program of this seminar is a city atlas. So each of the students has to prepare a personal work, a personal dissertation about one city in the world. The title of this collective work is The Worldwide Urban Landscape. Under this title, The Worldwide Urban Landscape, as a translation of Le Paysage Mondial des Villes, the collective works of our master seminar are dedicated to an atlas online, edited as a common archive at the website of WARPO domain. I could show you the exact address of this website. It is the place where a reflection about the city shape is elaborated and discussed wherever the cities are located on the continents and whatever their proper urban features are: demography, geographical and historical situation, formal or non-formal morphology, toponymy, social and cultural background, etc. These collective works aim at an extended and cumulative knowledge about cities around the world, all the urban extensions, all the social and spatial situations. The goal is to make the urban topics proliferate and to make up an original cartography of this urban landscape. As soon as this work is written down or drawn and designed, not on a paper material, but within the specific format of the HTML language and wiki software, pages are not a material anymore, but an URL address. So these addresses are linked together, such as roads or paths or vicinal catways, getting from one place to another in such a way that a virtual cartography is to be constructed. For us, the main interest lays on the thematic construction and internal structure of this city atlas. The seminar makes a number of students work together, about 100 for the last semester, wherever they are coming from. More than half have a specific experience of foreign cities. Either they are foreigners themselves, or having got the opportunity of a journey in different countries through the Erasmus program. So the gathering of these diverse experiences gives us the chance of an enlarged approach of the city world. If all the students within the seminar are supposed to be French-speaking, we wish and expect, my colleagues and I, that all of them would be able to bring together a large spectrum of languages, modes of writing, and to make their own cultural routings able to be manifested and shared. Our conviction is that this diversity of languages is the only condition to be able together to explore the diversity of the urban conditions around the world. So if the dissertations written by the students are all written in French, I expect a sort of enlargement which could make us able to understand the variety of specific geographical, social, spatial conditions formulated and expressed through different languages and through different modes of writing. If it would be possible to show you some pages of this atlas, but probably it would be better to do that afterward.
Okay. Just a second. I had expected to show you some, to go back to some of the entries in the glossary during the presentation, but maybe I'll do as Jean is expecting to and just get to that later on. What I want to show you today is very much unfinished. For the moment, it seems a bit further from being finished every day, and that's probably the good as well as the bad news. It clearly needs more definition from a practical point of view. The technical structure that this project will require in time is very much still an issue. Conceptually, there are some questions as well. But as it advances, it seems more and more worth doing. So I guess on the whole, the news is pretty good. The project I'm referring to is in the first instance an educational one involving bi and multilingual collections of words and images that I've chosen to call a glossary after much thought for a number of reasons that I'll get to later on. One of the things I want to stress is that while it's an educational framework, I would hope that fundamentally it has an interest that goes well beyond that. That in a sense, it's a kind of a working tool, a working object for design, for thinking about, for not only for looking at cities but also for imagining how they might be transformed. I should say that while the beginnings of all this was in the idea of CLIL, of content and language integrated learning, there are times when I forgot that it was about language, and that I'm still capable of forgetting that and thinking of it as a design project, or a project concerning design. One thing that I should say is that the project is, as it's developed, it's an Archive 21 project, of course. At the same time, it sort of grew out of a context in which I'm working with Jean Tally and several other people, and where one of the recurrent issues has to do with the way that words meet images, how we, in observing urban territories and in pointing things out, in designating what we see with words, we position ourselves in order to be able to design. So there's a broad context here that we may get back to later, and a number of student projects outside of the seminar that Jean Attali has just presented, and outside of what I've been doing with the students. I mean, basically in their own thesis projects, there are a number of applications of ideas that are very similar to what we're discussing today. We give. I'll move on. I'll move on from there. I was going to give some examples, but maybe it's best that we do that later. Now, there's one basic question for me that I have to put out to you right away. It's this: on what terms might one achieve a veritable principle of integration between, on the one hand, spoken language or discourse, and on the other, architectural and territorial design practices? Okay, so how do we get to the point where there's a complete sort of fusion of the approach that we're developing, including, and on the side of language, it's obviously it has to do with the languages that are familiar to us, but also languages that are more foreign to us. The hypothesis here that I would like to offer, having no particular competence in Pew, is that the integration can be achieved through a particular understanding of the idea of translation. I want to lay out some ideas about what I understand in this context by translation. That is, I'm thinking of it as a multi-directional process that involves not only moving from one language to another, but also the interactions that designers and others explore between discourse and image, movements from one territorial setting to another, how an idea or a form can in a variety of ways migrate from one context to another. And finally, how our ideas about urban form or territorial form on the one hand can affect or interact with our ideas about architectural form on the other. So that's the first question. I'll develop that a little bit as we go. Also, from there I want to sketch out the idea of a word and image glossary, starting from a proposed construction of ideas based on theoretical sources and previous practical experiences in design studios and theory seminars. I'll go on from there to present our first attempts at giving form to this glossary project, drawing on some of the entries. Actually, we'll get to the entries maybe during the discussion period. And so in doing all this, I would like to stress the correspondences, but also the non-correspondences between the glossary as it is at this point and what I hope it will be in the future. Okay. Now, okay. So let's get into this a bit seriously. First of all, there are two pairs of notions that I think I need to develop a bit. One pair is integration, so the integration of CLIL, and translation. And the other two notions are designation and design. Okay. The project is clearly about students enrolled in a school or involved in Erasmus mobility programs that may speak one or several languages foreign to the place they've come to, and that often do not really know the language of the school they've come to. These are the kinds of practical dimensions that are clearly involved, that we all know. Speaking of territories and of architecture, they will, of course, evoke, the students will, both experiences that they've had directly, but also experiences they've had in reading or in looking at images, projected or printed images. In both cases, their way of doing so will reflect the languages and discursive cultures that they inhabit, or rather, perhaps I should say that inhabit them. The work of translation they do amounts to an act of displacement of elements from one's experience, from one discursive context to another. I can't help thinking, as I say this, of the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who insists on the fact that all knowledge is local, that all productions of thought emerge in specific times and places, or we could say situations, that even scientific knowledge of the most rigorously abstract kind is constructed based on interactions between specific sites. An individual is a discursive site in him or herself, and at the same time participates in one or several discursive situations in which others are involved. Now, the point I want to emphasize and develop in mentioning all this, in talking about these displacements from one site to another, is that they involve several operations that can legitimately be called translations. Now, I would tend to list them in this order. These concern specifically architects, but obviously by extension they concern many other people as well, and many other disciplines as well. First point, the act of identification and designation to oneself of things perceived, the support for which can be internal, let's say mental images, or external graphic ones. All manner of perceptions can count here, by the way. When I talk about image, I think sonic images are just as acceptable potentially as a material as visual ones might be, for example. This is all about putting words onto things seen, that things seen or things perceived. Sometimes, I just want to make one note, I think this experience has made this very palpable to me. Sometimes the word, when we're dealing with words that are very defined, dictionary definitions, for example, or words developed in a very precise way in a scientific concept, the image and word fit together like a hand and a glove. And in a sense, the image is reduced to the role of the illustration of what the word, the illustration of the meaning of the word. In other instances, the two seem to resist each other, or they seem to develop a kind of a more tense and complex relationship where each remains a bit autonomous. I think both conditions are essential and interesting, and so one of the things about this project is that it has to accept both more poetic or evocative ways of speaking about things seen and more precise, constructed ones. Second point, beyond this effort of designation that one make for oneself, there can often be an additional effort required in order to communicate what one has seen or believes one has understood to others, possibly in a language or with recourse to visual means, in a language, a different language from one's, a language a little less familiar to oneself, or with other visual means. Now, a final point, which perhaps brings us more specifically to design issues. Translation as well from the register of things seen or from the realm of things as we feel we've understood them to that of active engagement or transformation of things. The translation is a creative process that displaces or destroys, creates, recreates form and meaning. I think this is, if one accepts this broad idea of translation, this is as much true when we're speaking of words as when or language as when we're speaking of what we do as architects. I just want to make a little sort of reference here quickly before going on to what I see as a kind of a line of thought, or a series of ideas that perhaps start with people like Peter and Alison Smithson, with their interest in social configurations of space and movement, or Denise Scott Brown, more than Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, who was interested in not only in pop culture, but also in the idea that architectural forms could have some kind of an inherently social dimension. If architects only knew how to find those forms, there would be a difference then between making architecture that incidentally satisfies social needs, and an architecture which, in a sense, is more engaged directly with them. From people like Scott Brown or the Smithsons up till Koolhaas, I think this question, similar questions have been asked, and this business of designation, of translation or movement between words and images plays an important part in such attitudes. Now, the last little theoretical sort of element before I start talking about more practical dimensions here. When I use the word translation, I'm clearly thinking of the French sociologist Bruno Latour, for example. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I thought I should mention the importance of Latour in the approach that the idea that I've been trying to develop of translation. Also, in a sense, I mean, perhaps even more than Latour, there's Michel Serres, the French philosopher Michel Serres, whose trilogy called Hermès is entirely about issues of communication and translation. The issues he's discussing are personified for him through Hermès, this Greek god who bears a really complex relation to a number of figures: the traveler, the merchant, but also the huckster or the con artist, and the thief, but finally also the poet. So there is this sense that in entertaining a kind of a complex relation with the meanings of words and how they transform themselves, how they travel, how they attach themselves, as they adhere to things, or with time adhere, don't adhere anymore, et cetera, et cetera. There's a kind of a process of creation that's at work that goes well beyond the strict dimension of language. Okay, so those are some first ideas. We can speak of them at length later. I hope that we'll get into them. Quickly, a few things about the glossary. Clearly this project wasn't about writing a dictionary. It wasn't about choosing words and defining them. That much is pretty clear at this point. The term glossary comes obviously from the Greek word glossa, which means tongue, but which also means an obscure or foreign word. When the first glossariums are created in the 14th, 15th century, they tend to be specialized vocabularies. They're thematic vocabularies linked to a specific discipline, for example. But they also tend to be about translating that language, that vocabulary from one language to another. So there's both the dimension of translation and also something that's one could say of an ontological character, because it's not just words, any and all words, but rather families of words or series of words that maintain complex relationships amongst themselves. One of the interesting things about the word gloss and glossa is that it also means to add luster. Defining, the word means to define an obscure word, but also in a sense in defining it to make it bright, to give it luster. The glossing over is a pejorative expression in English that implies that we're not understanding anymore, that we're just looking at the surface. I think that sort of play that the word suggests between a deep understanding of the word and the fact that in defining it, in glossing, we actually, in a sense, cover up the deep meaning and sort of settle on one specific way of saying what it is we're talking about. That kind of ambiguity is something that seems very interesting to me. It seems entirely appropriate to the kind of exercise that we would like to set up here. Okay, now again, we can go into more detail about the use of the terms gloss and glossary. But I think that, because I think there are a number of issues that we really could spend a fair bit of time understanding. Now, let's just, I'd like to conclude by talking a bit about the way we went ahead in a practical sense with this project. We did it in the context of a sort of an odd seminar in which students are defining the subjects of their thesis projects. Here we're in first semester here. The students are reading, looking around, mapping, deciding on just generally putting themselves in a position to be able to define and carry out a project in second semester. So we're somewhere between a studio and a seminar context, in a sort of a hybridity at this point. Now, among the things we asked the students to do was at the very beginning was to develop an entry for the glossary. The assignment was simple. It was, in a sense, simple. It was to choose one image and an image that showed something that was important to them, to name that thing or that quality, and then to write an entry in the language of their choice. Most often it was French, but not always. That entry then had to be translated into another language, and we, for simplicity's sake, one might say out of cowardice, because we didn't know quite exactly how we were going to manage such an extreme complexity when there are, potentially 10 different languages occurring, we asked them to do it in English. So we did nonetheless end up with a certain number of entries in other languages as well, which is a good thing. The students were also asked to create a caption for the photograph, bilingual caption, which would give not only the notion but a kind of a first sense of how the image that they chose was related to the word that they had found, the word that they had settled on. So we did this. We got results that surprised us in that some of them were the fit was almost too perfect or too obvious between the word and the image, too obvious to be all that interesting, and others where one really had to make an effort to understand what it was that the student was actually wanting to do in connecting what he or she was writing with what he or she was showing. That exercise quickly ended up seeming quite an interesting one. And it did leave us wondering to what extent we should restrain or organize or direct what the students were doing. But in the end, we didn't. We opted for leaving things fairly wide open as we asked them to do a second entry. And to rework their first entries also. There was an ongoing process of redefinition. There was a bit of dialogue between the students and us to put things together. Now, the second entry, what did we do? We figured that we needed to explore a form of connectivity between the different approaches, the different things that were being written and presented by the students. So we asked them to either choose an image already used by someone else, and to write on that image. So they could develop another notion from the same image if they wanted, for example, but they would use an image that was there already. The other option we left open for them was the idea of using the same word but introducing a new image. All of this allowed us to create a kind of a first sense of what a kind of a web, sort of an interconnected whole might be like. We didn't, at any point, as I have said earlier, refuse that students write entries in their particular dialect of Chinese, or in German, or in Spanish, or Portuguese. We have a certain number of entries in foreign languages, and I must say that I don't know what to do with those for the moment, because they're too isolated a phenomenon In a way, we would have to go to a much greater scale with this project before those entries could actually have some kind of value. One of the other things that we have never really developed, and that is for the moment a serious, I think, limit to what we're doing and an incoherence in what we're doing, is that we haven't yet found a way of, clearly you can look through the list of words in alphabetical order. The alphabetical order is for the moment based on the principle that we'll mix words from different languages. At some point, we're going to have to distinguish them from one another. We don't know exactly how, but we also, for this project to be coherent, there also has to be the possibility of looking through the images and going to the words afterwards. We were considering a kind of an approach that would involve just simply one big sheet or one big scroll that would allow you to kind of look at images, but that somehow seems a bit too simple, a bit unsatisfactory. So I'm entirely open to what might be, to ideas you might have about how the entering into this process through the image as a viewer might be developed. What else can I? There was one or two other little points. I've spoken a long time. I'll just conclude. The project now was carried out in a design studio context. That's very clear from the entries. That's part of why they're interesting, but it's also a bit of, for the moment, a bit of a limit to what we're doing. We need now to have this glossary used in language courses, and it would also be interesting to discuss on what terms schools in other countries might contribute. We weren't able to do that earlier, but it would be interesting to introduce, to develop a collaboration that would, with others, that would allow us to go further in the idea of further in the sense of a development of relations between more than just two languages, so that we don't have to position everything with English in a kind of central position as we have for now. Okay, thanks. I hope that is fairly clear, but in any case, we'll look at examples to go further after.
It might be the moment now to show the images, both of a urban atlas and of the glossary. Jean, can you proceed, please?
Do you have the image of the... No. Could you please tell us if you got the image, the front page of the city atlas? Yes, okay. Um, I would like just to show you the list of the different dissertation we got from 2008 to 2012. As you can see on this list, there are several regions and continents, and for each of them we have a series of dissertations like this. So all these dissertations are an amazing opportunity to enter the complexity of the different urban situations located in different countries and different regions of the world. Some of these dissertations are prepared and written by foreign students, Chinese students, for instance, but also by French or European students having had the opportunity to travel through China or Korea, etc. So the gathering of these different works is very provocative for us. And we had a discussion about the possibility from I'm looking for look at this. We had a presentation by a Chinese student writing in English because she's coming from Hong Kong, and putting on her page some Chinese characters. And we had a discussion. Is it good to have these Chinese characters untranslated or not appropriately translated from the Chinese language? And my answer was that it was very important to have this vision of the original, genuine language, to get the possibility of enter the cultural world she's coming from. So she's not only writing in English, which is the common language in Hong Kong, when previously Hong Kong was an English settlement, but the presence of the Chinese language is the seed of future understanding of what is at stake in this Chinese world. So I have a series of examples, dissertations written by Asiatic student, but also different propositions made by European students coming from different countries in Europe. So the question of what language is chosen to complete this dissertation within the master seminar, what is the language we allow to use in our exchanges during the seminar meetings is for us very important.
Okay, so I imagine several of you have already had a chance to look at this, the entries. This is the site of the seminar, the graduate seminar for the thesis project. Here are the entries presented in alphabetical order, but it's not yet a very good system. The system didn't work out that well. There are altogether about 80 entries. Many of the students just attached their second and third entries to the first one, so this is not yet a complete list. As you can see, the majority of the words are in French, but here and there's a word in Portuguese or in English. We're still operating at a very primitive level in terms of in terms of how we lay out all of this material. Now, a few examples of entries. You have entries that are written by French students. We'll use this one, where a bit the text. One thing that was interesting here is that the different degrees to which students actually made an effort to explain what difficulties they had or what was interesting in passing from one language to another. This particular student didn't, and most students didn't, in fact, but from time to time, a student will stop and say, this exercise isn't easy to do with this word. Which means that you can't say exactly the same thing or show exactly the same thing in one language as in another. But anyway, so this is an example of a good example, I guess, of the most typical sort of kind of thing we had, which was a French student writing a bilingual English-French entry and using several images to illustrate it. Now, another example. This is a student from the Canary Islands who is working on his own, the island he comes from. He's working on situations that are occurring there. One thing that's interesting is the choice of word, capitalism, and the particular approach that he takes to it in his text is clearly, it's a reflection on the one hand of the readings that he's doing now, but also on the experience he has in his own island of the development of luxury hotels and the tourist industry in general. So you have this kind of strange students reading texts, picking up a word, a notion or a concept from a text, and in a sense interrogating it or working around it based on their own experiences. I'll show you one or two more, and we'll stop there for now. Here's an example of a student in Hong Kong, from Hong Kong, presenting a phenomenon that's specific to Hong Kong, which is the cage house, a permanent form of housing for many people that literally involves living in a cage that next to anywhere from 15 to 30 or 40 or 50 other cages in a single apartment space. So she offers a kind of a description and to some extent a position of that situation to students. It's clearly intended for people coming from elsewhere who don't know about it. The question of the choice of word is the cage house. The fact that it's called a cage house in English is obviously something we could discuss. But her entry, I believe, is written in Chinese and in English. And obviously, with respect to that word, there wasn't really an issue of translation that caused her to sort of settle on the word and kind of discuss whether it was an apt one or not. Okay. I'll finish with just one more word. Okay, and that's it. Many of the images speak of the territory but don't show it. That's one thing that was a bit of a question for us. In the end, we let anything and everything happen because we figured it was later that we needed to make decisions about what would work and what wouldn't. But here, a student is speaking of the word incarner, to embody, and he in his text he develops a relation to the territory, but what he actually shows us are works by a number of artists from which he speaks about those territorial issues. There, that gives you a bit of a sense of the different positions that people can have depending on where they come from, and the relations that they have in there that they're working with that have to do with France to where they've come, or the problems that they might experience in working on where they come from, but in France, etc., etc. We need to go back down into the volume.
So we'd like now to open the debate. I'm sure you have questions to ask to our friends or things to say, so please, it's the moment. Either our partners online or the people present in the room.
Well, Tadeja Zupančić from Ljubljana speaking. I would like to comment on the importance of the visual language of the visual impact of the Chinese language, because during our coursework we emphasized the meaning of the melody of the language, of the sound of the words, which are important for the most important messages our students have. That's why this is the link I wanted to emphasize here. Thank you.
I'm very interested in your comment, because, as you know, in Chinese, there are so many homophones that it is quite impossible to learn only words. You have to learn complete sentences. And the sentence as such brings the melody of the language. So to get some hints of the Chinese language means to get some of the melody of the language. You were commenting also the role of the images. Stephen spoke about the relationship between images and words. I would say that images are, in a certain way, our lingua franca, especially in the School of Architecture. It's a means to make us understand each other, despite the differences of foreign languages we could speak, and despite the risk of understanding our personal positions. I'll give you just one example. To look at a layout, I mean a city map, as the expression of a specific cultural location is a way to understand the connection between a way of designing, a way of laying out a city, a way of writing down the codes of the country. I found I address the specificities of the different ways of laying out the city around the world. And for me, it's a clue to understand the differences between the different urban cultures. So the connection between the way we look at the maps, the way we look at the different ways of designing or drawing these maps, and the images in general, and the differences between the languages we are speaking is very, very important. So to speak different languages within the same meeting would be a good condition to enlarge this understanding.
Maybe just a comment to the sound of your language. For instance, your English sounds French, but Stephen's doesn't. This is what I have in mind.
When you said something about the Chinese language, for me, the Chinese language is a complicated language. I will not learn it because it would mean a lot of work for me. In a way, at the same time, it fascinates me. And I wish I could speak it and understand it. In a certain way, your language, Slovene, is the same for me. I mean, I will not learn it because I'm too old now. But I feel I like to hear you speaking Slovene. I like very much staying in Ljubljana. And how can one approach something of a language and of a culture? Can one approach something of a language and a culture with a few words, a few concepts, a few? I'd like to hear your answer about it.
Okay, well, first of all, you know that we experimented with just a couple of words in Slovene with our Erasmus students, and they used also their own, let's say, primary languages like Portuguese, whatever. And what helped us was the melody of their primary languages and also the melody of Slovene spoken through English. That's what I'm talking about. So we have both. We have just words, and we have this complicated structure and the way of writing Stephen was talking about, and the sound of the language, the secondary language, which is English in our case, from a person whose the primary language is, for example, Slovene. Because no matter how long we learn English as our secondary language, not from the early childhood, we keep using the grammatic structures and so on, and the way we complicate things in Slovene and so on and so on. You know what I'm talking about. And the same applies to Portuguese and to others.
Well, just quickly, I mean, given that we're in an architecture school, I mean, I think it's, without forcing the parallel, I think it, when we're discussing form, urban form, it's clear that we will perhaps go much further in understanding an urban form from a city that we don't live in, where people speak a language we don't speak. but there will be specificities that will escape us at first. And I guess one of the things that I'm finding interesting is that that sort of experience of seeing in the atlas or within the framework of the glossary a whole lot of sort of small pieces of urban form or elements of urban form is in itself a rich kind of experience, which is a bit analogous to what's going on at the level of language. There are probably discussions we can have, even if we will never speak Chinese or even German or Portuguese or whatever. There are discussions we can have about the fit between words in a language and the urban forms that we're looking at. And I think that kind of question of fit or non-fit between things is something that can be extremely instructive, but that can also be a source of creative material for designing projects.
Maybe, Stephen, I remember our discussion about this general level of understanding and the specific layers, and you have touched that question or that topic today during your speech. I wonder about maybe some further observations you had during your work with students. Because on the other hand, we had some experiments with Julie. Unfortunately, she's not here as our contribution to this lexicon discussion. And we tried to use mind maps and so on without avoiding the word translation, because it was very difficult for us to translate one term to another language, and we simply used connotations and images, and just to overcome this difficulty with the word translation. Mm-hmm. So first question is about your opinion or your observation now about the layers of understanding related to what you discussed, and maybe your interpretation of the word translation.
Maybe I should start with the word translation. When, as I mentioned, I had Bruno Latour in my mind as I was thinking about this idea of translation, and he has a particularly polysemic idea of what the word can mean. It's about it can also, for him, it can also be, for example, how words are used to identify things in things or qualities in one discipline with respect to another, and the kinds of the possibility or the non-possibility of some kind of understanding between disciplines that are speaking about more or less the same thing. I guess that's it's in that broader sense of how what I was trying to say earlier was that when I'm speaking of translation, I'm thinking of it as a process of displacement that can be, and it can be a displacement from a discipline to another, from a language to another, from the field of the image to the field of words. It's a bit all of those things at once. That's both what makes the richness and the difficulty of the exercise of doing this glossary. In a sense, if it works, it will work because it has a very simple, organized structure that allows you to move through it easily, that gives it a kind of a coherence as a framework, but it will also be something where the constraints are capable of producing a richness that there's no control over, in a certain sense. The idea that any one entry can produce a multiplicity of multiple effects. In the end, the criteria of success would be, I guess, the impression. If we created the impression of a certain thickness and the feeling that there's an infinite number of ways that you can go through from one entry to another, taking away something along the way. I don't know if I'm answering your question directly. I don't think I am, but I hope that helps.
Can I continue this comment? I'm Theodore from the Open University, and because I was planning to ask this question about translation and whether this it kinds of limit, it creates a limit and an artificial boundary of how we approach the concept of the lexicon. Because what is happening here is that there is a more complex structure than usual. There are mental images. There are images, there are different languages, French, English, and there is a process of creation, recreation of meaning and displacement, as you said. So there is such a complex structure of how all these things are linked together that it is very difficult to see how the concept of translation can be applied in this context. Of course, you can say that you can translate from images to natural language and from one natural language to another, but nevertheless, it is the web that counts. It is this connection structure that creates the meaning rather than one move from one domain to another. And in practical terms, that is what's happening anyway. I mean, I remember myself as an Erasmus student in Paris, that I learned to speak the language because of because of translation, but because of designation, maybe, because you designate stuff and connect stuff together and create this structure. Because of integrate stuff together, and you create this complex structure. And in one sense, that might go together with what Latour is trying to convey, maybe. But I have the same reaction with, I think, Tadia's comment.
Just an autobiographical note, maybe to explain a kind of a a thought that I have listening to what you're saying. I first studied composition, music, composition of cello. I hesitated for a long time to study architecture, and finally did it. And I'm a Canadian from a family with Greek origins who lives in France. So I guess. Let me to start with this business of music, for example. I mean, I understand what you're saying about designation, but I guess one of it makes me think of an impatience I have with this project, which is that it comes from my experience of being a musician and at first and then an architect afterwards, which is that there are so many of the ways that I look at architecture that come directly from music, and I don't know to what degree the passage through words is actually indispensable to the relation that I'm establishing. What's frustrating in a way with this project is that it is in fact very hard to not pass through words in getting from one. In bringing about a displacement, but theoretically, at least, I mean, not theoretically, it is possible. It is possible to make displacements that don't depend on words. It seems to me, and as architects, I think we can be sensitive to that. The problem is to create a structure in which we can see that happening, and in which we can encourage that kind of thing to happen, to make the move as directly as possible from music to pictorial space, or as Pierre Boulez attempted to do in a book about play a few years ago. Huh? So I guess, yeah, and it's just a comment, because the total asymmetry in what we've created between words and images, the fact that the image is in a sense loose against the words, is a source of frustration for me. I feel like we should be able to do better than that.
Shall I continue that in, if the word metaphrasis, which is a Greek word for the word translation, what is the relation between paraphrasis, because of your Greek origin, I am asking that, about metaphrasis and paraphrasis, which is two very, very similar terms, but they have slightly different meaning.
I feel like letting the philosopher answer that question.
Yeah.
You wanna...
We have had some discussions about the figures or the tropes, the rhetoric ways of making sentences. I guess that it would be difficult for us to put this exchange on this grammatical literary platform. I think that in a school of architecture, our realm is the world of both images, models, discourses. And as soon as we speak of translation, actually we speak of relationship between different modes of expressing ourselves or expressing the meaning of our works. So if I like a lot the idea of this glossary Stephen was speaking of previously, it is because it's a sort of apparatus to make understandable the system of connections and disconnections between a way of expressing ourselves through the images and a way of expressing ourselves through discourses, speculative discourses, for instance, and the way we are expressing ourselves through making models in architecture, for instance. So the displacement of meanings is not only a question of linguistic issues. It's a question of putting our words within this sort of environment made of images, models, discourses, patterns, etc. And architecture has to do with discourse, has to do with materials, has to do with drawings, has to do with models, and our background has to be aware of oneself through these different ways of doing things and thinking of things, you know. So in architecture, the issue of translation is very specific, and the glossary that Stephen was speaking about is just a way to make us aware of this original situation.
Yeah.
I propose that we resume the presentations. We will have another discussion time at the end. And this second part will focus both on CLIL and then on Erasmus effects on language and culture. So first we shall listen to Jean-Yves Gillon, who will speak in French.
I've actually just had to replace somebody at the last minute. For this web conference, for Tempo. Just one moment, there's a technical problem. Sorry about the technical problems. Okay, he's just going back from the beginning now. The main point is that in this intervention, I'm going to talk about teaching of vocab and the limits of a certain approach of a teaching of vocabulary. And of course, what is particularly interesting, not the limits, but the ways in which we can get beyond the limits. In language teaching, or in the teaching of a particular subject, in a foreign language, vocabulary is an essential question. Of course, if we don't know a language particularly well, it's typically a problem of vocab, words that we don't have. Either we have an incomplete comprehension of if you don't have a complete mastery of syntax, it's far less important than vocab problems. And yet, I've noticed that problems of knowing vocabulary or not are just one moment, please. So, excuse me, problems of vocab are often something that aren't properly seen to and dealt with in this matter. Sorry, we have technical problems here in Paris because we don't have headphones and a mic, two mics. Excuse me. So we're going to try and proceed slightly differently. L'angle mort. Okay. Sorry, we're trying to figure out how to actually get the translation working here so that we can have you. Even though the problem of vocab is essential, this problem doesn't always allow us to develop explicit strategies in pedagogical approaches. When the teaching of a language and subject are brought together, we find ourselves in a very particular situation, a very strange situation. So we have to find a solution. We have to develop specific strategies. Two aspects will appear. On the one hand, because we're talking about the teaching of a subject, langue de spécialité, the specialty language, which is a subject that isn't often treated, and we haven't developed this point much. It is evident that whether one has to teach maths or architecture in a foreign language, or whatever other subject, maybe, one has to ask the question as to whether we have to ask about how to approach the discourse, not only vocabulary but discourse. And once we talk about discourse, if you look at how to deal with the problems of discourse, you immediately see that having lists of vocabulary with their translation simply doesn't suffice, because the discourse of a specialty is not comprised of mere words, but it can also be specific syntactical structures. For example, a slightly simplistic example would be, if we're talking about history, we'll often be talking in the past tense, or if we're speaking of maths, different ways of formulating a hypothesis. We're also dealing with communication in situations where communication is at the forefront. So we have to ask ourselves, when we're analysing discourse, qu'est-ce qu'on dit, qu'est-ce qu'on écrit? We have to ask ourselves, what are we saying? Who are we saying it to? How we're saying it, etc. And it's within this framework that the lexicon or glossary should be taken into consideration, which cannot be separated from the discourse itself. Maybe all this is evident, but I thought it best to remind you of it. The second aspect, which is probably more interesting, which will be certainly developed further in the future, is that when we teach a subject in a foreign language, one places oneself in a perspective which is that of bilingualism. Because the way that one defines bilingualism is that in which one teaches a subject in a foreign language and not just the foreign language itself. And therefore the question arises, what does it mean to be bilingual? I'm not going to try and answer this question because you know that there are different definitions and minimalist and maximalist ideas as to what bilingualism is. What I'm going to do is simply observe the fact that, and everybody I think will agree with this, that being bilingual is not simply being able to speak a foreign language. I, like everybody else, can speak a few foreign languages, not terribly well, like everybody else. That does not mean I'm bilingual or trilingual. Being bilingual suggests that in the foreign language that we're bilingual in, we are no longer in a foreign language, we are in our language. This does not mean that we master it as a local, let's say, but we're comfortable in that language, comfortable enough in that language. We're home, even if we're not in our primary residence, to say it metaphorically. This all implies. Why did I talk about bilingualism? Because I want to underline the fact that if we're talking from a bilingual perspective, there is the question that when one learns a language and when one discovers that one is, oh, hold on. Excuse me, we're just starting that again. From a bilingual perspective, or rather, if we are trying to become bilingual, the question of the cultural appropriation which accompanies a language has to come first. That's to say, learning a language can't happen in a state of ignorance vis-a-vis the cultural aspects, the infinite cultural aspects that accompany the language. But there has to be an exploration of cultural aspects and the acquisition of cultural tools, of linguistic tools, excuse me, they go hand in hand. You have to have both the linguistic tools and the cultural background. And it's within this framework that we will have to re-ask the question of vocabulary, the glossary. From this bilingual perspective, it can't simply be a question of learning words. Words in order to communicate, for us to get by, sort of tools. One has to go further and explore. One has to go further and explore the wealth of languages in the language that we are trying to acquire. This implies exploring the wealth of words in the language we're trying to acquire. This implies that a certain number of words in this language, which are particularly important for the culture of this language, that these particular words are typically the hardest ones to translate. I'm referring here to the famous dictionary of words that are impossible to translate, which was published in 2004 by a team headed by the philosopher Barbara Cassin, which is a dictionary which has a philosophical bent because it's son nom. Because it has the title European Vocabulary of Philosophies, and the subtitle Dictionary of Words Impossible to Translate, which I quoted first because the author considers that this subtitle should have been the real title of the book, and always quotes the book as having the title Dictionary of Impossible Words to Translate, and not the other. Untranslatable, intraduisible being impossible to translate, or untranslatable. Maybe intraduisible is an untranslatable word, or a word impossible to translate properly. But if I were to shed light a little on what I'm talking about here, I will quote an expression of the author. The intraduisible, impossible words to translate, are not the words that one doesn't translate. It's what one never stops trying to translate, or one never stops translating. And therein lies their wealth, because these words carry within them something of the experience of a culture which is not inaccessible to men from a different culture, but make it impossible to be conveyed by another word. They're sort of rebellious to translation. So this actually applies to all manner of areas. The approach in this vocabulary of untranslatable words is asking oneself, what does a word cover exactly? What is associated with a particular word in a particular culture? And why is it that one will be unable to find in another language a word which covers exactly this ensemble of references? The question of the cultural appropriation of a vocabulary can gain from an exploration of the world in which hold on. The world in which the words of a language swim. No, that's not what we're looking for. The world which is immersed in the words of a language, which is, of course, the world that these words create. Because this world does not pre-exist these words. Now, as far as sort of concrete questions, how do we proceed? I think that there are tools that one still has to invent. Sort of meditating on the importance of what we could call the intercultural meditation on words is still searching for its translation, its transposition in education, education and learning, in teaching and learning. The example that the glossary of inhabited territory, territoire habité, gives us, of urban territory. Sorry, could you repeat that? So the glossary of urban territory seemed to me, because I discovered it from the outside, I just came to this project slightly late, seemed to me an excellent example of innovative strategies for the exploration of the background of words. Everything that gives flesh to words. Beyond the skeleton of a glossary, which would be a simple word-for-word translation. But what I'd like to sort of point out a few things that I noticed, and I think I'm going over my time. What I noticed was that each contributor when he or she defined the selected term brought his own personal experience to the word. And from this intercultural perspective, the whole point is that words are at the source and the reflection of, I didn't hear the last words you said, l'origine et le reflet. The words are at the source and the reflection of human experiences and not just mere tools. Another important aspect, which I was surprised about, is that each contributor is asked to translate, and by translating discover this sort of instability of meaning from one language to the other. Flottement de sens, I'm translating it as instability of language, or which I found on the site of the school, which seems to me interesting and fertile. Looking at this idea of instability of meaning, looking at it more closely, will show us more clearly differences, cultural differences, or just one moment, please. The cultural gap separating the cultural gaps that show up when one is facing difficulties in translation, for example, these instability of meanings, the underlining of cultural differences or cultural gaps, the awareness of these gaps, all this should not dissuade you from cultural exchange, but on the contrary, should provide a base and should invite people to should invite you to go further in these cultural exchanges. And I come back to what I said earlier, that what is untranslatable does not prevent you or put you off translating, but invites you to continue translating. He's thanking me for my translation, but actually, I'm sorry if it was impossible to follow, because we don't have anything. So I hope you managed to understand something. He's afraid. maintenant et il faut tout écrire à ce moment-là. Parce que j'ai vu un peu.
Kiitos, nastawasz do mnie nie slyšel.
Hello, everybody. There's a few technical problems that we're trying to sort out. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to see the PowerPoint presentation, so I will give you a short summary of it. Today, I'd like to insist on the role of mobility the role of the mobility in Erasmus mobility and what impact on the excuse me, this is I'm going to give you a summary of the PowerPoint presentation about mobility and the impact the Erasmus program has on students and their linguistic competence. For this purpose, I have taken a number of different studies that were promoted by the CIEP. And more specifically, one study that was done for the French National Agency, which allowed us to analyze all that's been written on student mobility within the Erasmus framework. I'd like to highlight a few facts, figures. Of the Erasmus program in order to show you how the experience of students from this school, but also students from your institutions, are similar to those of other students in Europe. Since it was created in 1987, over 2 million students could go abroad. And this year, there'll be over 3 million who will have gone on an Erasmus program. And more higher education institutions are taking part in this program, in this Erasmus program. The institutions which are partners of Archi 21 are some of the most popular destinations that the students would like to go to. A number of European studies have asked the question, have asked the students about what their expectations were regarding their stay abroad. The first one concerns the possibility of living abroad. The second is the possibility of meeting new people, acquiring different competences, specialities, and intercultural experiences. And finally, the possibility of improving their linguistic competences. As far as linguistic competences are concerned, the students have mentioned the following. The students, as far as the students are concerned, it's what it does to their linguistic competence that is the main impact of an Erasmus program. And future employers tend to agree with them as far as the linguistic competences acquired abroad. And we can attest to the veracity of this information by reading different studies that have been published throughout Europe. But there is no single project on a European scale which attests to the improvement of these their linguistic ability. So this is one of the points missing in this research. They underline, however, the fact that the more one is exposed to the language, what they underline is the importance of a lengthy period abroad and the possibility of communicating in a foreign language in different contexts. For instance, an academic context, in informal situations between students. And they also call attention to the fact that they learn a more complex vocabulary, And they also develop certain sociolinguistic competences. And a capacity to interact and to master new technologies. They either acquire these competences at university or in internship. Because the Erasmus program also allows for a professional internship. Which could be an interesting way of lengthening the RKey 21, of pursuing it, or could be an interesting addition to it. Sort of going beyond the acquisition of the foreign language, going beyond that and onto internship or professional work. Competence in language in the singular or the plural. Because the destination of the Erasmus students goes well beyond well beyond the countries where they the countries where they've actually learnt the language at school. This is how numerous students can actually start to learn certain languages that are not as common. Which helps promote a multilingualism on a European level. However, Erasmus type trips really help to acquire English, especially. Because most of the courses that the Erasmus students choose are taught in English. The studies and the research underline the role of the training before leaving, yes, before they leave on their Erasmus day. And the work done before they leave in their university. So it would be possible to do research with the students who actually participated in RKey 21 and the students that were not able to participate in it. And my hypothesis would be that preparation and work done in the university that they actually study in before leaving would absolutely improve their stay in their stay abroad. The main impact, which is sort of self-evident but still remains to be proved, Excusez-moi. So the main impact then is the improvement of linguistic competence, language competence. The second is the identity building experience for students. Their Erasmus helps them actually build their personality, helps them become who they are. With this very interesting tension between the individual who is searching for himself and the group that he will meet. So that's why the Erasmus students underline the importance of their social life with other students while they're on their Erasmus, and in the society that they find themselves in. It's a sort of a three-part equation in play. In the Erasmus experience, it's a three-part equation. So as far as the improvement of social competences of the students are concerned, this mobility, one notices that the mobility is the result of a decision on the part of the student and contributes to the student's independence, teaching him how to behave in social circumstances, and how he will be able to adapt to new situations. This will all help him with this. What I mentioned before was that from a language point of view, the experience abroad allows the student to acquire vocabulary, but also acquire a certain skills in behaving in society, sociolinguistic skills, which the student will acquire and will develop these socio-linguistic competences in fact are impossible to acquire outside of an authentic communication context. And no, that doesn't. An authentic context. Excuse me, we're debating as to how to translate this. So this is a very different experience from learning a language at school, because when they are placed in a context abroad where they have to communicate in an authentic situation, it brings with it skills that they wouldn't ordinarily acquire just by being at school. This Erasmus stay then provides a meeting between a personal research to build their identity, and the acquisition of competencies recognized on the labor market. A number of European studies have underlined that the necessary competencies, necessary for the labor market were those that employers recognized in those students that had traveled thanks to their Erasmus program. Flexibility, the ability to work in a multicultural environment, working in a team, teamwork, linguistic ability and linguistic competences, are among the competences which are sought after for the labour market. In a globalized world. And I would like you all to think about the following. How can one improve the possibilities of participating in this program? Because only 4% of students participate in this exchange program. How can we attest to the improvement of the linguistic competences? Have you conducted studies in your respective universities? How can we better prepare our students in view of their future mobility? And I think that the project, the RQ21 project, which is such a rare project in higher education, constitutes like a first step, and which could be used by other disciplines. And finally, how can we better how can we create synergies between mobility, the student mobility, and teacher mobility? We're very interested in this subject because we are currently researching the impact of teacher mobility within the Erasmus framework. And one of the first things we've seen is that teacher mobility actually encourages student mobility. And that a global vision of internationalization improves each individual mobility. Here are a few things for you to think about, or that we could discuss today, or in other contexts. Thank you. Thank you, George. Is anybody there?
Okay. Hello? Hello? Is there still somebody? Yes, thank you.
Yes, we are.
Yes, okay. Are you ready for a few minutes of debate or discussion between all of us? Any question about those two presentations? About the limits of the vocabulary approach, or the impact of the Erasmus program on linguistic.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Theo.
Yes, I'm wondering, it's something very specific, but because I had a very difficult experience with that, is about preparation. You mentioned about preparation in the university before students go to the Erasmus. But this is usually very, very difficult and hard to do, especially when the target country is a country where, for instance, from UK to Slovenia, or to Greece, from Greece to Slovenia, this is very, very hard to prepare students. And so how do you envisage this preparation?
So this question is for Annick and Anne-Marie.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
La préparation, donc l'ouvrage le plus intéressant sur la question de la préparation.
The most interesting work on preparation is a work by Madame Anquetil, which was published in 2006.
Mais elle avait ce point commun qu'il s'agissait simplement d'étudiants apprenant le français langue étrangère.
That's it. But there was a unity of language. It was about students learning French as a foreign language.
Ensuite, votre question, c'est
And your question was how to prepare, from a specific point of view,
la préparation vers une destination
for a destination,
dont le contexte est dont
a different type of destination.
la question est là, est-ce qu'il n'est pas possible de mutualiser, donc de partager avec d'autres universités
Is it possible to sort of share with other universities
qui envoient des étudiants
who are sending students to
cette destination,
the same destination, the same target country?
de mutualiser
Is it possible that we could prepare a student's departure together?
souvent les spécificités liées à l'accueil, à la préparation au stage Erasmus sont réalisées, sont réalisées par les universités d'accueil.
The preparation is usually done by the target universities.
La préparation est là, peut être faite par l'établissement d'emploi, est la plus générique et de donner des clés, aux étudiants concernant leur manière, la façon d'envisager leur mobilité.
Universities, the ones sending the students abroad, what they generally do is give a few tools which they think will help the students for their mobility.
Ensuite,
But it's limited to that.
je connais le programme effectivement et le projet Euromobile.
I do know the Euromobile program.
Il existe également des projets
There are other European projects
qui ont créé des kits
which have created kits
pour les étudiants,
for the students
pour les préparer
in order to prepare them
à leur déplacement.
for their trip, for their change of address, for their new country.
Là, il s'agit donc, à mon avis, c'est une préparation, je dirais, non reliée aux spécificités du pays, mais à la dimension interculturelle.
These kits are typically not specifically designed for a certain country or other, but rather the intercultural aspect of the whole business. And the main difficulties
sont le plus souvent liées
are
au manque de préparation et à manque de définition des objectifs
are
de l'étudiant lui-même.
due to the lack of a clear idea of what the difficulties will actually be from with each individual student. There's not enough of that.
Donc l'accompagnement peut être un accompagnement classique à la mobilité, c'est-à-dire définir les objectifs d'apprentissage.
So what would be interesting would be to define the difficulties, the learning difficulties.
Des projets et notamment des recherches-actions très intéressants ont été menés sur la didactique de la langue et de la langue académique.
There have been studies that have specifically targeted the didactic aspect of the
le fait de poursuivre un enseignement en langue étrangère.
the didactic aspect of experiencing a language abroad. Yeah, courses in a foreign language.
Donc, là, la préparation a été dans la langue cible.
So they've been prepared in their target language, and it's been beneficial.
Vous trouverez à la fin de la bibliographie des références sur
In the bibliography,
les recherches menées
you'll find
sur la préparation.
references for the preparation in view of mobility.
J'espère avoir répondu.
I hope I've answered the question.
Il y a une question ici qui pose partie, Jean-François Poulain.
So there's a question from Jean-François Roulin, who is here with us, about Erasmus.
Existe-t-il des évaluations de compétences académiques et professionnelles par rapport à ce programme?
Are there any studies made on the academic competence of students who've gone on an Erasmus vis-à-vis students who have not gone on an Erasmus? Is there a difference? And she answers, you brought up a very interesting question. Of course, there are practically no research on this question. Some research on students in medicine. But this is certainly an area that hasn't been thoroughly researched by any means, and is probably the least well represented area of the whole Erasmus program. So perhaps if anybody wants to research this, it would be very welcome. Certainly, this was one of my conclusions. Yes, this is one of my conclusions, i.e. to highlight the fact that there is practically no research in this particular domain. Certainly not enough in order to be able to answer his question, for example. Donc, c'est-à-dire, ceci peut être mis en rapport avec la question. This question, if nobody has any answers, could also be linked to the earlier question of vocabulary that was mentioned earlier.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Can I just make a comment, a brief one? My name's Julie Watson. I'm from the University of Southampton. We run a pre-arrival online course for all international students coming to our institution. So that includes students who are not Erasmus and Erasmus students. And we tell them approximately 3 months before they arrive about the online course, and we give them access to the course. And the course includes a range of materials which covers interactive material, introducing them to academic skills partially, but also to the university itself, the campus, the different faculties and disciplines, to the city of Southampton they will be living in. And we cover a lot of practical issues, like we take them to an online supermarket so that they learn about budgeting for their meals in the UK. And we provide a social aspect insofar as we link them to each other before they come. So students can meet other students coming from the same departure country, and also to, for example, Facebook groups that exist at the university, so they can make contact with students who are already here. And this has been very successful. The feedback we've had from students about this course has been very positive, in terms of that it, particularly in terms of that it improves their confidence before they come, and addresses quite a lot of the initial questions that they have about studying abroad. It doesn't look in depth at the issues of developing specific vocabularies for specific disciplines, but it deals with quite a lot of the intercultural issues you've been talking about.
And they do that at the University of York as well. Makes people feel very at home before they actually get to the campus.
Mm-hmm.
Very useful.
Yeah.
I'm just going to translate what you've just said to the French people here. Donc, Madame vient de dire, Julie Watson vient de dire que dans son université de Southampton, il y a un cours qui est donné sur le web pour que les étudiants qui soient soit Erasmus ou non Erasmus puissent accéder à, par exemple, à la fois des acquis, des compétences académiques, la vie du campus et la vie de la ville elle-même, et surtout des outils très pratiques. Par exemple, il y a un supermarché online qu'ils peuvent visiter pour pouvoir bien savoir comment dépenser, pas trop, etc. Et elle a dit que ça a été, les étudiants en ont parlé de façon très très positivement. Il y a aussi par le biais de Facebook, des étudiants peuvent se connecter, se connaître avant d'arriver, et ça améliore leur insertion sur le campus. I think I got it all, or more or less.
Yeah, you did a good job.
What I would like to add is that the Erasmus students' preoccupation is quite important. We have a wealth, we have a treasure with these students, either ours in foreign universities or the ones we receive. And we must do something with this treasure. The glossary is an example of taking into account this cultural and linguistic riches of students. There are many others. They have things to say about the organization of the university or school, of the way of teaching or learning. They have many things to say, and until now we have not really listened to them. And so I think it is something quite interesting for the future.
I have a question about the first presentation. I don't know whether, maybe I'll translate myself, maybe that's easiest. Donc je commencerai avec le français. Bon, merci pour votre intervention. Je suis curieux de savoir si vous avez connaissance des études où il est question de l'articulation entre la culture visuelle ou la culture ou des approches qui disons des disciplines où on procède beaucoup par des méthodes d'observation et l'apprentissage des langues. Hein. Il peut y avoir quelque chose d'analogue entre ce que j'ai présenté dans une école d'art, mais aussi dans une école d'anthropologie, par exemple. Hein. Je ne sais pas, est-ce qu'il existe d'autres études donc où il est question de l'articulation entre le domaine du langage et le domaine du domaine visuel. Just quickly, I'm asking whether whether our guests know of any studies that develop an articulation between the dimension of language and the visual dimension, or cultures of observation that could exist in art schools, but maybe also, for example, in an anthropology department or elsewhere. Some other examples that could help us to develop what we're doing here.
Oui, pardon. Malheureusement.
Here we go. Unfortunately, I can't answer your question.
Dans son sens le plus général,
your question in its most general sense would imply hundreds of thousands of works, because the question of the articulation of the visual and the word, spoken word, is very vast, from philosophy to ecology and many other areas. But with regards to teaching, what we can conclude from this in order to be better teachers, I absolutely have no titles to give you. I can't answer your question with anything specific, actually.
Well, if there is no longer any question tonight, or at 5 p.m., snowing in Paris, that will remind you of very, very cold days you spent here 2 years ago. So, well, we wish everybody a very nice week. And it was our first web conference. We had to deal with the technical preparation was quite good. Still, we're not used, nor equipped to do this kind of things. So it is, I think, a kind of technical success, because we could speak languages, speak here in Paris and with you abroad. The translation was a difficulty, but it is part of the project anyway, and it is part of Europe. We have to translate, we have to make the effort of understanding each other, otherwise we'll speak something a very poor language, so it was quite a good thing. And somebody want to add something on the lexicon with Julie Watson? Yes. Okay, Julie, please.
I think Anya's going to say a little bit about it first of all. She's trying to bring it up on screen. This is Anya. Are you going to speak? And
yes,
then
I'm here.
Okay. If you say a little bit about it, and then I will add something if you've missed anything at the end. Okay.
Okay. So we prepared the mind map for fragility, lighting, and movement, and the idea was to put in the middle the fragility and then go to the general meaning and to the specific meaning. And then we wrote down the English, different connotations and slowing, and we add also some photo material. So if you can see here on the general meanings of fragility, for example, we put down the delicate, breakable, subtle, and so on. And then on the other side, we also went to the details and describe a bit in English, and in French, I think so, and it's so on. So, Julie, do you want to add something more?
Yes, perhaps just that we chose to use this tool very much in an experimental capacity. What we were aiming to do was to explore some of the key terms in the fragility theme that the students of architecture and design had been working in, explore some of the key terms and look at some of the connotations of those terms. So you can see text mapped with images that represent some interpretations of those terms within an architectural and design context for the students and staff involved. One further point is that this particular tool, which is a free tool to use, as well as allowing text and image, also allows you to embed audio. So there is some potential for creating these maps of key vocabulary, kind of different kind of way of presenting, a kind of glossary in a more multi-dimensional way. So that's what we were trying to do with the project, and we did, with this particular mini project rather. We didn't get very far with it, but you can see, as Anya's showing you here, the kind of connections between the things we were experimenting with.
I have a question. You hear? Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes. This is Scott Chase from Aalborg University. As I think many of the people on our project know, we did a little bit of experimentation with the mind maps for this lexicon exercise, and actually decided to abandon the mind map as a mapping, diagramming, representation tool, because mind maps, by their very nature, are strictly hierarchical. And what Ola Peel was wanting to do was something that was more of a general graph, which is much broader representation. We didn't really have the time to go forward with it. We did explore some additional online tools, but I'm just curious to Julie and the people from Ljubljana whether you experienced any restrictions in the way you were trying to represent these concepts by using this very hierarchical approach with the mind map.
Well, we focused on the differences between translating words into images and words to words of another language, and instead we focused on this connotation and glossary thing instead of vocabulary and lexicon and stuff like that. And we haven't bothered ourselves with this hierarchical structure, because you can use any structure to show that the meaning is diverse and that it has several layers. Perhaps even hierarchical structure helps you to show the idea of different layers of meaning, and we didn't feel that as an obstacle.
Okay.
Because you can use this hierarchic structure both ways or several ways, and you put these hierarchies together in your mind map in your head, you know.
Yeah, I guess maybe my question is.
I think it would.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Sorry, I was just thinking while you were saying it today, it would be really interesting to get, and we got not very far with this, but it would be really interesting to have got students to try to create these mind maps and to ask them about, you know, whether there were any limitations, how it worked for them, I think.
Yeah. We need another project, no?
We do, absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we shall end with those happy and optimistic words. We need another project to realize all the ideas that we have and that this project has given us. So thank you very much. It's 5 o'clock, and that was the time to conclude the meeting. So bye to everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, thank
Goodbye.
you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye from Moira.
Bye to all. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Moira.
Bye.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected. Goodbye.